She had been keeping the Duke's books in her head for 11 months. Not literally his books. Those were kept by Mr. Harrow, who was the estate accountant, and by 2 assistants who reported to Mr. Harrow, and the keeping was done in a set of leather-bound ledgers that lived on the second shelf of the private library, and that Clara had never been asked to touch. Her job was the dusting of the shelves that held the ledgers and the polishing of the desk at which the ledgers were consulted, and the setting of the tea tray that was present during the meetings at which the ledgers were discussed. She dusted, she polished, she set the tray. She also, because she had her father's mind, and her father's mind did not come with an off switch, read everything she could see from wherever she was standing, and organized it with the specific automatic precision of someone who had been doing this since she was 7 years old. Numbers that crossed her field of vision were filed. Patterns in the filed numbers produced conclusions. The conclusions accumulated across 11 months of dusting and polishing and tray, setting into a comprehensive picture of the Blackwood shipping empire's financial situation. The picture was not good. The picture was, to be accurate about it, the picture of a structure that had been built on assumptions that were no longer valid, and that was being managed by people who had not updated their assumptions to account for the ways the world had changed around them. She had been watching the structure with the specific attention of someone who understood what they were looking at, and who had no mechanism for doing anything about what they were seeing, which was the particular frustration of her situation. She had a mechanism for understanding things. She did not have a mechanism for acting on the understanding. This was the specific condition of her life, which she had accepted with the practical efficiency of someone who had assessed the available options and determined that acceptance was the rational response to an unalterable situation. She was a woman, which meant certain rooms were closed. She was a servant, which meant certain other rooms were closed. She was educated, which was not a quality the closed rooms were designed to account for, and which therefore existed in a category for which no room had been built. She had her father's library. She had the inside of her own mind, which was a very well-organized space. She had the ledgers on the second shelf, which she was not permitted to touch, but which she could read from 3 feet away while dusting, because her eyesight was excellent and her memory was what it was. And she had for 11 months the specific private occupation of knowing what no one in this house knew she knew. But before we go to the negotiation, before we stand in the private library while the most feared businessman in London lays a trap and a parlour maid picks up a pen, I need to ask you something. If you had the knowledge to prevent a catastrophe, but using the knowledge meant violating every rule of the room you were in, would you speak? Or would you stay silent and watch the catastrophe happen? Drop your answer in the comments, because Clara had approximately 45 seconds to decide. Subscribe and hit the bell. And tell me where you are watching from tonight. Your city, your country. Let me know who is in the room now. Let's begin. Her father had been a scholar. This was the beginning of the accounting, not of the estate's finances, but of Clara herself. The account of how a woman ended up with a photographic memory for numbers working as a parlour maid in the house of a duke who believed women's minds were built for embroidery. Edmund Walsh had been the kind of scholar who was better at scholarship than at the practical management of a life which was a combination that produced excellent books and unreliable income. He had written 4 significant papers on the mathematics of trade economics and 1 monograph on maritime law that was considered by the people who considered such things to be the definitive work on the subject. He had also consistently forgotten to collect payment for his tutoring, had trusted the wrong people with the investment of his limited savings, and had died when Clara was 19, leaving her with a library, a thorough education, and 11 shillings. The library had to be sold. The education could not be sold. She had stood in the empty room that had been her father's study, surrounded by the ghost outlines of books that had been there all her life, and she had thought about this distinction with the honest practicality of a woman who was 20 years old and needed to eat. The education was the thing she had. The education was also a thing she could not present to the world in any form that would be received as the asset it was, because the world had specific systems for receiving assets, and her education was not legible in any of them. She could not walk into a counting house and present her understanding of maritime tax law as a credential. She could not walk into a merchant's office and present her memory for numbers as a qualification. She could walk into a house and present herself as capable of dusting shelves. She had done this. She had done it with the systematic efficiency she brought to problems that required pragmatic solutions, and she had identified the Blackwood household as the specific household to apply to, because the Blackwood household had a library that she could access in the course of her dusting duties, and the library had books that she had not yet read, and the reading of books that she had not yet read was the one form of nourishment she was not prepared to go without. The Blackwood household had hired her without difficulty. She had been there for 11 months. Duke Alistair Blackwood was not a stupid man. She had been clear-eyed about this from the beginning, because she was clear-eyed about most things, and because the temptation to categorize him as simply stupid was the kind of intellectual laziness she had no patience for. He was not stupid. He was intelligent in the way of people who had been operating successfully in a specific domain for a long time. He understood the social and political architecture of the House of Lords with the expert precision of someone who had been navigating it for 20 years. He was a skilled negotiator in the contexts where his intelligence had been trained. He read people accurately. He also had embedded in his intelligence, like a structural fault in otherwise good stone, a comprehensive and absolute blind spot. He believed that women could not think. Not in the general way of men who said things like this because they were the things that were said, but genuinely, specifically, in the way of someone who had organized their entire worldview around this belief and had spent 20 years selecting evidence that confirmed it. He had looked at the women in his world and had seen women who embroidered and arranged flowers and managed social calendars, and he had concluded that this was because embroidering and arranging flowers and managing social calendars was the ceiling of what women were capable of, rather than concluding that this was because the women in his world had been given nothing else to do. Clara had identified this blind spot in the first week and had thought, "This is useful." It was useful because it meant he did not look at her. She was the furniture that dusted itself. She was the mechanism by which the tea appeared. She moved through his library and his study and his dining room with the specific invisibility of a category of person that he had decided was not worth seeing, and the invisibility allowed her to see everything. She had seen the ledgers. She had seen the accounts meeting in October, where Harrow had presented numbers that she had recognized immediately as missing a variable. The new harbour tariff schedule that had been enacted in the summer and that Harrow had apparently not incorporated into the projections. She had watched the Duke receive the numbers and make decisions based on them, and she had stood with the tea tray, and she had held the correct numbers in her head. She had said nothing. She had said nothing because saying something would have required explaining how she knew, which would have required explaining that she had been reading the ledgers while dusting, which would have required explaining why she had been reading the ledgers while dusting, which would have produced a conversation she was not prepared to have with a man who believed women's minds were built for embroidery. She had said nothing in October and in November and in December, and across the first months of the new year as the structural fault in the estate's financial management compounded with the specific momentum of problems that were not addressed. She had also, across those months, assembled a complete alternative accounting in her own head. Not because she expected to use it, but because she could not stop herself from doing it, because the problem was visible to her, and her mind addressed visible problems the way water addressed inclines. She had the accounting. She had no mechanism for applying it. She had thought more than once about the mechanism problem, about the specific architecture of her situation, and whether there was a version of it in which the knowledge in her head could become action in the world. She had not found a satisfying answer. The available paths all required doors that were closed. And then Lord Stirling arrived, and the doors question became academic. She had known Stirling was coming because she had heard the preparations for his arrival discussed in the household with the specific energy of people who were frightened. Stirling. His name had a quality in the household that other names did not have. The quality of something that was said carefully, with the specific awareness of people who understood that the wrong word spoken aloud at the wrong moment had consequences. He was the man who had taken apart the Pemberton Trading Company in 3 meetings. He had restructured the Cavendish estate in ways that the Cavendish family was still recovering from 7 years later. He was known to have a team of lawyers who identified legal vulnerabilities in contracts with the specific systematic thoroughness of a man who understood that money was a weapon, and documents were the delivery mechanism. He was not known to lose. She had heard the Duke preparing for the meeting with the specific quality of a man who was constructing his confidence from the outside in. Telling himself he had advantages, telling himself he had leverage, telling himself this was a negotiation between equals because to think otherwise was not something he was prepared to do. She had listened to this and she had thought, he does not understand what he is walking into. She had also thought, I need to read Stirling's contract before the meeting. This was the thought she had not expected to have. It had arrived with the specific quality of something that had been waiting to arrive. Not an impulse, but a decision that had been made at some level she had not been consulting. and that presented itself to her consciousness as already made. She needed to read the contract. She had read it. Not the full contract. She had not had access to the full contract, which was in the Duke's private correspondence, and which was not in her area of responsibility. But she had seen 3 pages of it when she cleared the study on the morning of the meeting, which was enough. 3 pages of a sterling contract were enough for someone with her specific education and memory to see the structure of the whole. She had seen the trap. It was elegant. She found herself appreciating it with the specific aesthetic response she had to elegant solutions, even when the elegance was in service of something destructive. It was constructed in 3 parts, each legitimate individually, each appearing to address a separate issue, the 3 together forming a mechanism that would transfer 80% of the Blackwood fleet to Sterling's holding company within 18 months, in a way that would be legally irresistible and practically invisible until the transfer was complete. The harbour tax clause was the load-bearing element, and it was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of illegal. Sterling's contracts were never illegal, which was the point of them. Wrong in the sense of containing a mathematical error that was itself a trap within the trap. The clause appeared to reference a specific taxation structure that had been revised by an Act of Parliament in 1798, and the revision had changed the way harbour fees were calculated in a way that made Sterling's clause, if signed, require the Duke to pay the same harbour licensing fee twice, once under the old structure the clause was ostensibly referencing, and once under the revised structure that the Act had created. It was not an accident, it was a gift that Sterling was offering the Duke while taking everything else, and the gift would only be discoverable if someone in the room knew maritime law well enough to see it. Sterling had bet there was no one in the room who knew maritime law. She had read her father's monograph 7 times. She had gone to the meeting as the tea maid. She had poured the first cup. She had listened to 30 minutes of Sterling doing what Sterling did, which was construct the negotiation around his framework with the systematic precision of a man who had built the maze and knew every turn in it. She had watched the Duke's confidence erode with the specific visible quality of a structure that had been built from the outside in when the outside encounters something stronger than itself. She had watched the Duke reach for the pen. She had placed the second cup. She had spoken, "Forgive me, Your Grace." Her voice in the room had the quality of something that did not belong there, not because it was wrong, but because it was unexpected, which produced the same effect. Both men looked at her. The Duke's look had the quality of someone who was being interrupted in a moment of extreme personal distress by a category of person he had not been attending to and was now required to attend to against his will. His expression was the expression of a man who was embarrassed by the interruption and frightened by the situation, and was having both of those experiences simultaneously. Sterling's look was different. Sterling looked at her the way she had been looking at the contract, with the specific immediate attention of someone assessing what they were encountering. "If you sign that line," she said, "you are paying for the same harbour twice." She said it clearly and without embellishment because clarity was the correct instrument for this moment, and embellishment would have invited the dismissal that clarity might survive. The Duke said, "Silence, girl. Leave the room." She had expected this. She had prepared for this in the 45 seconds between seeing the pen move and speaking. She had known he would say it, and she had known what she was going to do when he did. She waited. She waited because the Duke had said it and Sterling had not. She was watching Sterling. Sterling raised one hand. "Wait," he said. "Let the girl speak." His voice had a quality she had heard described and was now hearing directly. The voice of a man who had absolute authority in whatever room he was in and was accustomed to that authority being recognized immediately. He was not asking the Duke. He was informing the Duke. "What do you mean, twice?" Sterling said to her. She looked at him. She had a specific decision to make in this moment, which was the decision about the level at which she was going to engage. She could give the surface answer, the simple identification of the error, the minimum necessary to accomplish the immediate goal. Or she could give the full answer, which was the answer that demonstrated that she understood the entire structure of what he had built. She looked at him. He was watching her with the assessment quality. She gave the full answer. She walked to the table. She picked up the pen. She circled 3 clauses. She began. The maritime tax laws of 1798 were not, on the surface, the most accessible subject for a parlour maid to command in a private library in front of the most revered businessman in London and her employer, who had just told her to leave the room. She was not thinking about the surface. She was thinking about the specific structure of what Sterling had built, which she had been examining in her head for the past 30 minutes while she poured tea, and which was considerably more sophisticated than the harbour clause alone. The harbour clause was the visible problem. Under it were two additional layers that together constituted the mechanism she had identified. A cross-referenced liability structure that used the ambiguity of the 1798 revision to create an obligation that looked like a standard maritime partnership clause but was, under careful reading, a complete transfer of operational control within a defined period. She explained the harbour clause first. She did this not because it was the most important, but because it was the most immediately legible, and because the legibility would establish her credibility for the more complex structures that followed. She cited the 1798 Act by its full designation, which she had memorized at 14 from her father's monograph. She cited the specific section and subsection. She described the revision and what it had changed and why it had changed it, and what the consequence of the change was for harbour licensing calculations. She did this in approximately 2 minutes. Then she moved to the second clause. She was aware as she moved that the room had changed. Not the physical room. The library was the same library. The afternoon light was the same. The mahogany table was the same. The quality of the room had changed. The quality of who held the attention of the room had changed. The Duke had not moved. Sterling had leaned forward. She circled the second clause and she explained the liability cross-reference and what it did and how it did it, and what the mathematical consequence of it was in terms of the fleet's operational independence over a period of 18 months. Sterling was watching her with the expression she had seen on her father's face when she said something he found unexpected. The specific expression of genuine intellectual engagement, which was different from the performance of it, and which she had been able to tell apart since she was 9. She moved to the third clause. The third clause was the most elegant, which she said, because she was not going to pretend the construction was not elegant simply because it was designed to be destructive. Pretending the construction was not elegant would have been intellectually dishonest, and she was not going to be intellectually dishonest in front of a man who would identify the dishonesty immediately. The structure is sophisticated, she said, not looking at either of them but at the 3 circled clauses on the document. It is built in layers. Each layer is defensible independently. The first layer exploits the 1798 ambiguity. The second uses the cross-reference to establish an operational liability. The third converts the liability into a transfer mechanism. No single clause is the problem. The problem is the combination. She looked up. Sterling was looking at her. "You read the contract this morning," he said. 3 pages, she said. 3 pages, he said. His voice had the quality of a man repeating something to understand it. "I was clearing the study," she said. "I read quickly." He was quiet for a moment. "Sit down," he said. She sat. The next hour had the quality of the most focused intellectual engagement she had experienced since her father's study. And it had additional qualities that her father's study had never had. The specific quality of a genuine contest, of 2 minds meeting at the level where both minds were actually operating rather than at the level where one was performing for the other. Sterling was extraordinary. She had expected this. She had heard the accounts and had assigned them the appropriate weight, given that accounts about powerful men frequently exceeded the reality. She had been prepared to discount some of what she had heard. She had not discounted very much. He was quick in the specific way of minds that had been training against difficult material for decades. He identified the flaw in her initial restructuring proposal within 4 minutes, a timing issue in the revised partnership clause that would have created an unintended liability in the 3rd year. She had not seen it when she proposed the restructuring. She saw it the moment he identified it. "You are right," she said. "The 3rd-year exposure is real. The correction is to subordinate the partnership commencement to the harbour review cycle rather than the calendar year." He looked at her. "Show me," he said. She picked up the pen. She showed him. He studied it. He offered a counter-proposal. She studied the counter-proposal. She found the issue in it. He found no issue with her correction of his issue. This was the moment, she would think later. The moment that the quality of the contest became visible to both of them simultaneously, which was the moment that the contest became something else. Not because the contest ended, because it elevated. They were no longer performing for the room. They were not performing for anyone. They were doing the thing they were both built to do, which was to look at complex structures and see them clearly. And they were doing it at the level where each of them was operating at their actual capacity rather than the managed capacity of a social performance. The Duke had said nothing for 40 minutes. She was not thinking about the Duke. She was thinking about the international trade provisions that Sterling had introduced into the restructured proposal, which were elegant and which also contained a jurisdiction problem that she had identified because her father had spent 3 months corresponding with a Dutch maritime scholar about exactly this issue, and she had read every letter. "The Amsterdam provisions are clean," she said. The Rotterdam jurisdiction is not. The 1805 commercial treaty created an ambiguity that the Rotterdam courts have used inconsistently. You cannot rely on that provision holding. Sterling stopped. He looked at her. You know the Rotterdam jurisprudence, he said. My father corresponded with Dr. van der Berg at the Rotterdam Maritime Faculty, she said, for 3 months in 1809. I read the correspondence. He was quiet. Your father, he said. Edmund Walsh, she said. He wrote the 1807 monograph on maritime law. Something happened in Sterling's expression. Edmund Walsh's daughter, he said. Yes, she said. He sat back. He looked at the document. He looked at her. He picked up his pen. He began to write. The new contract took 45 minutes to produce. It was not the contract Sterling had arrived with, which had been the mechanism for transferring 80% of the Blackwood fleet to his holding company. It was a genuine partnership contract, structured around the revised harbour provisions, with the Rotterdam jurisdiction replaced by a London arbitration clause, with the third-year exposure corrected, with the operational independence of the Blackwood fleet protected in terms that she had written and that Sterling had read and had revised twice and had ultimately signed. It favoured the Duke. Not egregiously. Sterling was not a man who signed things that egregiously favoured the other party. But the terms were fair in a way that Sterling's contracts were not generally fair, which was a form of victory that she had not anticipated when she stood up from the tea table. Sterling capped his pen. He picked up his copy of the signed document. He stood. He looked at the Duke, who had been sitting at his own table for 1 hour and 20 minutes, watching his parlour-maid restructure a contract with the most feared businessman in London. Sterling smiled. It was not, she noted, the smile of a man who had lost. It was the smile of a man who had found something he had not been looking for, and found it worth the finding. Alistair, he said. You are a fool, the Duke said nothing. Your maid just saved your duchy from my claws, Sterling said. He looked at the door, then he looked back. Fire your accountants and pay her what she is worth. He left. The library received the silence. She was still sitting in the chair where Sterling had told her to sit. The signed contract was on the table. The pen she had used to circle the 3 clauses was still in her hand. The Duke was at the end of the table. She looked at the contract, and she thought about the specific sequence of the past 2 hours. And she thought about what came next, which was the part she had not planned for, because she had not been planning. She had been responding. The plan question had not been available in the 45 seconds between seeing the pen move and speaking. She looked at the pen in her hand. She set it down. She stood. I apologize for the interruption, Your Grace, she said, with the composed efficiency she brought to all professional matters. I will return to my duties. She moved toward the door. Clara, she stopped. She turned. He was looking at the contract. He was a man who was in the process of understanding something, which was visible on his face in the way that understanding was visible when it was genuinely occurring rather than being performed. He was understanding several things simultaneously. The specific compound understanding of a man who had been wrong about something fundamental and is sitting with the scale of the wrongness. My sister, he said. She waited. 2 weeks ago, he said. She suggested we restructure the harbour provisions before the meeting with Sterling. He was still looking at the contract. I told her to return to her drawing room. He looked up. She was right. Yes, Clara said. She was. He was quiet. I said a woman cannot understand business, he said. She looked at the pen on the table, at the 3 circled clauses, at the contract that was now signed in the Duke's favour. You said it required an iron mind, she said. Not a delicate heart. Yes, he said. I have my father's mind, she said, and my own heart. I have not found them to be in conflict. He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the contract. He looked at the ledgers on the second shelf. He looked at her. How long, he said. Have you known about the harbour provisions? She thought about the honest answer. Since October, she said. He stared at her. You identified the October problem, yes, from across the room. I read quickly, she said, and I remember what I read. He was quiet. I did not speak, she said, because I did not have a mechanism for being heard. He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it, the specific visible process of a man revising his understanding of a situation he had believed he understood. Harrow's accounts, he said. Are they? They are missing the 3rd quarter adjustment for the revised tariff schedule, she said. And the Northeast Fleet depreciation has been calculated against the 1808 values rather than current market. The exposure is approximately £11,000 understated. He looked at her. Approximately, she said. I have not seen the full ledger. Only what is visible from the second shelf. He looked at the second shelf. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. Clara, he said. She waited. He was a proud man. She had known this for 11 months, and she knew it now, looking at his face, which was doing the specific difficult thing that proud men's faces did when they were required to be accountable for their pride. I have been a blind and arrogant fool, he said. She looked at the window. I insulted your entire gender, he said, while you were keeping my house from burning to ash. He paused. For 11 months, I was keeping your books, she said. In my head, your house was not in immediate danger until today. He looked at her. Please, he said, do not leave. She looked at him. I am not leaving, she said. I live here. I do not want a maid, he said. He looked at the signed contract, at the ledger on the shelf, at her. I need a partner. She was quiet. She thought about her father's library, sold room by room. She thought about 11 months of standing next to problems she could see and could not address. She thought about Sterling looking at her across the mahogany table with the expression of genuine intellectual engagement. She thought about the Rotterdam jurisprudence and the 1798 Act and the 3 circled clauses and the moment the room changed. She thought about what it meant to finally have a mechanism. The accounts, she said. I would start with the accounts. Harrow's depreciation methodology is the most urgent. The Northeast Fleet situation requires immediate attention before the spring trading season. He looked at her. Yes, he said. I will need access to the full ledgers, she said. Not from across the room. Yes, he said. And I will need to correspond directly with the harbour authorities, she said, in the estate's name. Yes, he said. She looked at the second shelf, at the ledgers that had been there for 11 months while she stood 3 feet from them with a duster. I will start tomorrow morning, she said. She went to the shelf. She took down the first ledger. She sat at the table. She opened it. She began a year later. The desk in the private library was a good desk. Substantial, well-made, with the quality of things that had been built to last rather than to impress. It had been the Duke's desk for 20 years. It was now by the specific arrangement that had been established in the 12 months since Lord Sterling's visit her desk. Not by displacement, by reorganization. The Duke had acquired a smaller desk at the desk's right angle, which was the desk from which he managed the parliamentary correspondence and the social obligations and the various matters of the dukedom that did not require the mathematical precision she brought. Her desk was the desk where the ledgers lived, where the accounts were kept, where the financial strategy of the Blackwood shipping empire was organized. Sterling had sent a note 3 months after the meeting, addressed to her. It had said, Dr. van der Berg's correspondence is held at the Rotterdam Maritime Faculty. If you have not read the 1811 supplement, you should. It addresses the jurisdiction question we discussed. Yes, she had written back. She had read the 1811 supplement, which she had found through a bookseller in the city, with the specific persistence of someone who had learned not to let interesting problems go unaddressed. She and Sterling corresponded quarterly now. The Duke had found out about this in February and had been, she thought, approximately equal parts amused and impressed. He had said, with the specific dry quality he had developed across a year of working beside her. Sterling corresponds with 3 people in England. You, the Prime Minister, and his solicitor. In that order, I suspect. She had said he finds the Rotterdam question unresolved. So do I. The Duke had looked at her with the expression he had been developing across 12 months, which was the expression of a man who had been wrong about something significant and had decided to be comprehensively right about it going forward. He handed her the ledger. She took it. She opened it. Outside, the spring trading season was beginning. The Northeast Fleet depreciation had been corrected. The harbour provisions were restructured. The accounts were accurate to within a reasonable margin, which was the only kind of accurate that working accounts could be, and which she found satisfying in the way she found all honest precision satisfying. She was not a parlour maid. She was not entirely certain what she was, in the specific sense of what category the world had for her, because the world had not yet produced the category with adequate precision. She was the person who understood the numbers. She was the person who had picked up the pen. She was Edmund Walsh's daughter, who had his mind and her own heart, and who had not found them to be in conflict. She turned to the first page. She began. Tell me in the comments, which moment stayed with you? Was it the 45 seconds before she spoke, the 3 circled clauses, Sterling's Rotterdam challenge, or the morning she sat down at the desk? Drop it below. I want to know what you're carrying from this one, and tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country. Let me know who is in the room tonight. Subscribe and hit the bell, because the next story opens with a woman who is hired to teach a duke's daughter, and discovers in the first week that the daughter has been keeping a secret that explains everything strange about this house. I'll see you there.